There is a quiet shift happening in society right now that almost nobody in mainstream media wants to talk about, honestly. And it is not loud protests or dramatic headlines or political slogans. It is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It is silence, it is absence. It is what happens when a group of people finally stop arguing, stop pleading, stop explaining themselves, and simply leave. And once that happens, there is no apology tour, there is no going back, and there is no easy fix. This video is about that moment, the moment when men decided to do exactly what they were told to do for decades and the unexpected consequences that followed. If you stay until the end of this video, you're going to understand why so many people feel unsafe, anxious, and confused right now, and why the solution they are demanding will never come. Before we get into it, if you find value in these discussions and you want more clear, honest conversations like this, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you never miss a video the moment it goes live. That small action helps this channel more than you know, and it ensures you are always part of the conversation. Yeah. And while you are here, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description below. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, and if you want practical education on how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a world that is becoming more unstable by the day, the Academy is built for exactly that purpose. It is linked in the description, so go check it out now while you are thinking about it. And finally, if you enjoy these Angry Guy videos and you want to show direct support for the work that goes into them, you can do that by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to help keep the content flowing and the lights on, and I appreciate it more than I can say. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. Across social media platforms right now, there's a growing number of videos and posts from women expressing fear, anxiety, and confusion. They are saying they do not feel safe anymore. They are saying the world feels colder, harsher, and more isolating. They are saying that men do not look at them, do not talk to them, do not step in to help, and do not offer protection or reassurance the way they believe men once did. And they are framing this as a sudden problem, as if it appeared out of nowhere, as if something mysterious changed overnight. But nothing about this is sudden, and nothing about it is mysterious. This outcome was built slowly, deliberately, and predictably over decades. For years, men were told very clearly that they were not wanted, not needed, and not trusted. They were told not to approach, not to speak, not to offer help unless explicitly asked, and even then, to be cautious. They were told that masculinity itself was a problem, that natural male behavior was suspicious, and that even neutral actions could be interpreted in the worst possible light. Men listened, men adjusted, men withdrew. And now, for the first time, many women are experiencing the world without the invisible buffer that men once provided between them and reality. What we are seeing now is not men becoming cruel or heartless, it is men becoming compliant. They are doing exactly what they were instructed to do. They are minding their own business. They are avoiding risk. They are refusing to place themselves in situations where their intentions can be questioned, recorded, misinterpreted, or punished. When a man sees a woman struggling on the side of the road, he does not see a person in need anymore. He sees potential consequences. When a man sees a woman upset in public, he does not see an opportunity to help. He sees a scenario where stepping in could cost him his reputation, his job, or his freedom. So he keeps walking. This is the part that nobody wants to confront honestly. Men did not disappear because they hate women. Men disappeared because the cost of being present became too high. For decades, men were told that their role as protectors was outdated, unnecessary, and even oppressive. They were told that protection implied control and that any imbalance of strength or responsibility was inherently unjust. Men were told that women did not need them, that women had the state, institutions, and systems to replace everything men once provided. And so men stepped back and allowed those systems to take over. Now, the same voices that celebrated that shift are asking why they feel unsafe. They are asking why strangers no longer intervene. They are asking why no one checks in. They are asking why the world feels indifferent. And the uncomfortable truth is that this is exactly what was asked for. When men were told to go away, they did not argue forever. Eventually, they went away. One of the most telling examples of the shift is how men now behave in public spaces. Eye contact is avoided, conversations are minimal, help is withheld unless explicitly requested, and even then, often declined. Men are learning to move through the world quietly and invisibly, not because they want to dominate or punish anyone, but because they want peace. They want predictability. They want safety of their own. And the safest move in their experience is non involvement. This withdrawal extends far beyond casual interactions. Men are leaving dating altogether. They are no longer asking women out. They are no longer paying for expensive meals in the hope of connection. They are no longer offering emotional labor, financial assistance, or problem solving without clear benefit and clear boundaries. They are no longer stepping into protector roles by default. And for many women, this feels like abandonment, even though it is the direct result of long-standing messaging that told men they were not entitled to participate in those roles. There is also a growing realization among many women about the financial reality of independence. Living alone costs more. Sharing expenses matters. Having a partner is not just about romance, it is about stability. For years, independence was framed as liberation without trade offs. Now the trade offs are being felt in real time. Higher rent, higher bills, less margin for error, no backup, no safety net beyond impersonal systems, and systems do not show up with jumper cables at midnight. What we are witnessing is not a failure of men to care. It is the collapse of an unspoken social contract that once existed. Men used to absorb risk quietly. They used to step in without recognition. They used to put themselves between danger and others because it was expected of them. That expectation was dismantled piece by piece, criticized, questioned, and reframed as something negative. So men stopped offering it. Over time, many men realized something else as well. Being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. Once the pressure to perform, provide, and prove was removed, many men found a sense of calm they had never experienced before. They simplified their lives. They focused on work, hobbies, health, and personal peace. They stopped chasing approval. They stopped negotiating their worth. And in that stillness, they discovered that much of what they were told was necessary for happiness was optional at best and harmful at worst. This is where the idea of men walking away comes in. It is not a movement built on anger or revenge. It is built on clarity. It is the realization that participation is a choice, not an obligation. Men are choosing not to engage in systems and relationships that consistently punish them for showing up. They are choosing minimalism in their social lives, the same way they choose minimalism in their material lives. Less noise, less drama, less risk. And this is deeply unsettling to a society that relied on male participation as a stabilizing force while simultaneously devaluing it. The absence is being felt everywhere, in dating markets, in public spaces, in social trust. When men stop stepping in, the world feels colder because it is. Not because men made it that way intentionally, but because they were the ones quietly buffering it. There is also a psychological component to what is happening that rarely gets discussed. For years, many narratives encourage viewing men primarily as threats rather than individuals. While safety concerns are valid, constant framing creates constant distance. When men internalize that they are seen as potential problems first and people second, they adapt by reducing contact. They stop initiating. They stop offering. They stop engaging. Over time, this becomes the norm. Now we are seeing women express fear not just of isolated incidents, but of the absence of goodwill itself. And goodwill cannot be mandated, it cannot be legislated, it cannot be demanded. It only exists when people feel valued, respected, and safe themselves. Men do not feel that way in modern social environments, so they opt out. Another moment that revealed this disconnect was when large numbers of women publicly stated they would rather encounter a wild animal than an unknown man in a hypothetical scenario. Regardless of intent, the message received by men was clear. You are seen as more dangerous than nature itself. Men heard that, they remembered it. And now, when situations arise where help might once have been automatic, hesitation replaces instinct. This is not about bitterness, it is about boundaries. Men are drawing lines that were never allowed before. They are prioritizing self preservation. They are trusting observable reality over promises and narratives. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. They are no longer sacrificing themselves socially, emotionally, or financially in exchange for approval that can be revoked instantly. The result is a society where women are now encountering the world more directly without mediation. And that is a shock when you have been insulated from certain realities for a long time. It feels unsafe because it is unfamiliar. It feels harsh because it is honest. And instead of asking how this came to be, many are demanding a return to the past without acknowledging what drove men away in the first place. Men are not rushing back. They are not responding to guilt. They are not responding to shaming. They have seen that pattern before, and it no longer works. They have built lives that are quieter, more controlled, and more predictable. They are resting, they are recovering, they are focusing inward. And for the first time, many of them are genuinely content. This is the reality that no one wants to say out loud. Men walking away did not destroy society. Society pushed men out, and men accepted the exit. What we are experiencing now is not punishment, it is consequence. One of the hardest truths for people to accept is that social dynamics do not operate on intention, they operate on outcomes. It does not matter what anyone meant when they reshaped cultural expectations. What matters is how those expectations translated into behavior over time. When men were repeatedly told that their presence was intrusive, that their instincts were suspect, and that their involvement carried disproportionate risk, the rational response was withdrawal. Not protest, not rebellion, just disengagement. And disengagement, once it becomes habitual, is extremely difficult to reverse. For many years, there was an assumption that men would always be there regardless of how they were treated, that they would continue to show up, continue to provide, continue to absorb criticism, and still perform their roles because that was simply what men did. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Men are not infinite resources. Attention, protection, effort, and care all have limits. When the cost exceeds the benefit consistently, the supply dries up. This is not ideology, it is basic human behavior. What is especially revealing now is how many women are framing their discomfort as a crisis that men need to solve. There is an expectation that men should return to being present without any discussion of why they left or what would need to change for that presence to be sustainable. There is no acknowledgement of the years of hostility, suspicion, and social punishment that preceded this moment. There is simply fear, frustration, and a demand that things go back to the way they were. But history does not reverse itself that easily. The truth is that many men did not leave because of one event or one movement. They left because of accumulation. 1,000 small signals that said, you are not welcome, you are not trusted, and you are not valued unless you are providing something tangible with no expectation of reciprocity. Over time, men learned to measure interactions not by goodwill, but by risk. They learned that silence was safer than speech, distance safer than proximity, and solitude safer than connection. This has reshaped male psychology in ways that are still unfolding. And men are no longer orienting their lives around external validation. They are no longer measuring success by social approval or romantic outcomes. Instead, they are measuring it by peace, stability, and autonomy. That shift alone explains much of what we are seeing. A man who values peace above all else will avoid environments that are unpredictable, emotionally volatile, or punitive. Modern social spaces increasingly fit that description. There's also a deeper layer to this that involves trust. Trust is not something that can be demanded, it is built slowly and destroyed quickly. For many men, trust in social systems, relationships, and public narratives has eroded to the point where re engagement feels irrational. They have seen how quickly narratives can shift, how easily blame can be reassigned, and how little protection exists for those who act in good faith. So they choose certainty over possibility. This is why appeals to empathy alone are ineffective. Men are not lacking empathy. They are lacking assurance that empathy will not be used against them. The modern environment has taught them that emotional openness can be reframed as weakness, that involvement can be reinterpreted as intrusion, and that sacrifice can be forgotten the moment it becomes inconvenient. Under those conditions, emotional self preservation becomes a necessity. Another aspect that deserves attention is how this withdrawal has changed the rhythm of daily life. Men are spending more time alone by choice. They are investing in personal routines that do not depend on anyone else. Work, fitness, hobbies, learning, and quiet enjoyment have replaced social obligation. Many men report feeling lighter, more focused, and less anxious than they did when they were constantly navigating social expectations. This is not an accident, it is the result of removing friction. Critics often interpret this as avoidance or fear, but that interpretation misses the point. This is not about running away from challenge, it is about refusing unnecessary exposure to harm. Men still face challenges, they still work hard, they still push themselves. They simply do it on their own terms now. But once someone experiences that level of autonomy, it is very difficult to convince them to give it up. At the same time, women are encountering a reality that feels unfamiliar and unsettling. Without the informal safety net of male involvement, everyday situations feel more precarious, not because the world has suddenly become more dangerous, but because the buffer that once existed is gone. The expectation that someone else will step in has been replaced by the realization that no one is obligated to. That realization is jarring when it has not been part of your lived experience before. This has led to a paradoxical situation where women are expressing fear while also rejecting the conditions that once mitigated that fear. They want the outcome without the structure that produced it. They want protection without obligation, presence without expectation, and support without trust. That combination is not sustainable. Social systems require reciprocity. When reciprocity is removed, participation follows. It is also important to understand that men are not organizing around this withdrawal in the way many assume. There is no central coordination. There is no manifesto. There is simply shared pattern recognition. Men compare experiences. They observe outcomes. They adjust behavior. Over time, those adjustments converge. What looks like a movement is often just a convergence of independent decisions driven by similar incentives. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works when someone values the opinion of the group applying it. Men who have walked away do not. They have already disengaged from the source of that judgment. Telling them they are wrong, selfish, or harmful has no effect because those labels have been applied indiscriminately for so long that they no longer carry meaning. When everything is a problem, nothing is. There is also a generational element to this shift. Younger men are watching what happened to older men and learning from it. They are seeing the consequences of unchecked obligation and unbalanced expectations. They are seeing how quickly loyalty can be reframed as liability, and they are choosing a different path earlier. This means that the withdrawal is not a temporary phase, it is a structural change that will continue to grow. As more men opt out, the feedback loop intensifies. Fewer men engaging leads to more anxiety among those who expect engagement, which leads to louder demands, which further discourages participation. This loop reinforces itself. And because it is driven by incentives rather than ideology, it is remarkably resilient. What is rarely acknowledged is that men did not just provide protection in a physical sense, they provided emotional regulation in public spaces. Their presence moderated behavior, it set unspoken boundaries. When men disengage, those boundaries weaken, social friction increases, anxiety rises, and people begin to feel that something intangible is missing, even if they cannot articulate what it is. This does not mean that men should return to those roles out of guilt or pressure. It means that societies function best when contributions are recognized rather than resented. You cannot deconstruct a role and then complain when it no longer exists. You cannot tell someone they are unnecessary and then feel abandoned when they leave. The most uncomfortable part of this conversation is acknowledging that many of the current struggles are not caused by malice, but by miscalculation. Decisions were made under the assumption that certain supports would always be available. When those supports were removed, intentionally or not, the consequences became unavoidable. Blaming men for responding rationally to incentives does nothing to resolve that reality. Men walking away is not about dominance or resentment. It is about opting out of a system that no longer rewards participation. It is about reclaiming time, energy, and agency. And for many men, it has been transformative. They are sleeping better, they are calmer, they are more focused, they are less reactive, and they are unwilling to trade that stability for chaos again. This is why calls for men to return ring hollow. There is no compelling reason being offered. There is no assurance that conditions will be different. There is no accountability for what drove them away. There is only fear of the consequences of their absence. Fear is not an invitation, it is a reaction. If there is a path forward, it begins with honesty, not slogans, not blame. Honesty about what men contributed, why they left, and what would need to change for trust to be rebuilt. That conversation has not happened yet. And until it does, the silence will continue. And men are not rushing back into roles that can be revoked at any moment. They are not volunteering for responsibility without authority. They are not sacrificing peace for approval. They have learned the cost of doing so. And learning, once internalized, does not simply disappear. What we are witnessing now is the early stage of a long adjustment, a society recalibrating after decades of imbalance. The discomfort people feel is the friction of that recalibration. It is not evidence of cruelty, it is evidence of change. Men walking away is not the end of connection, it is the end of unreciprocated obligation. It is the end of silent sacrifice. It is the end of assuming that someone else will always step in. And whether people like it or not, it is a reality that must be understood, not denied. What makes this moment so difficult for many people to process is that it does not look like a traditional crisis. There are no dramatic scenes that clearly announce what has changed. There is no single policy, no single event, no single statement that can be pointed to as the cause. Instead, there is a growing sense of absence, a subtle withdrawal of effort, a quiet refusal to participate. And absence is harder to argue with than opposition because it does not announce itself. It simply leaves a void. For a long time, men were expected to be resilient to criticism in a way no other group was. They were told that strength meant absorbing negativity without complaint, that accountability meant accepting blame regardless of context, and that maturity meant silence in the face of unfairness. Over time, many men internalized these expectations until they realized that there was no endpoint, no moment where their patience would be rewarded or acknowledged. The demands did not stop, they escalated. And eventually, the rational decision was to stop engaging altogether. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this withdrawal is that it is not fueled by hatred. Hatred is loud. Hatred wants attention. Hatred wants conflict. What we are seeing instead is indifference. And indifference is far more permanent. A man who is angry can be argued with. A man who is indifferent has already moved on. He's no longer invested in winning an argument or proving a point. He is focused on preserving his time and mental energy. This indifference shows up in small, everyday choices that add up over time. Men choosing not to comment, choosing not to intervene, choosing not to explain, choosing not to defend, choosing not to date, choosing not to marry, choosing not to cohabitate. Each choice on its own looks insignificant. Together, they represent a fundamental shift in how men relate to society at large. Many women experiencing fear today are not reacting to danger itself, but to unpredictability. For decades, there was an assumption that if something went wrong, someone would step in. That assumption shaped behavior, expectations, and risk tolerance. When that assumption disappears, the world feels harsher, not because it has changed, but because responsibility has shifted. And responsibility, when felt directly for the first time, can feel overwhelming. It is also important to understand that men did not simply stop protecting women. They stopped protecting systems that punished them for doing so. Protection requires trust. It requires the belief that acting in good faith will not be used against you. Once that belief erodes, protection becomes a liability rather than a virtue. No amount of moral pressure can override that calculation. Another element that cannot be ignored is how modern technology amplified this shift. Smartphones, social media, and constant surveillance changed the risk profile of everyday interactions. A moment taken out of context can be replayed endlessly. An accusation can spread faster than a defense. Men learned that the safest move in a world where everything can be recorded is to avoid being involved at all. This is not paranoia, it is adaptation. Men began to notice that they were being asked to carry responsibility without authority, obligation without appreciation, and risk without protection. Over time, that equation stopped making sense. When people talk about men walking away, they often imagine a dramatic rejection of society. In reality, it is far more mundane. It is men choosing the path of least resistance in an environment that became increasingly hostile to their presence. What is especially striking is how many men report improved mental health after disengaging. Less anxiety, less stress, fewer conflicts, better sleep, more focus. These are not trivial benefits. Once experienced, they become non negotiable. Asking someone to give that up requires offering something equally valuable in return. So far, that offer has not been made. The narrative that men are abandoning responsibility is also misleading. Men have not stopped being responsible. They have narrowed the scope of their responsibility to what they can control and what directly benefits their lives. They are still working, still contributing economically, still maintaining personal discipline. They have simply stopped volunteering for unpaid emotional labor and social risk. This shift has also exposed how much of social stability relied on informal male participation rather than formal systems. When men disengage, institutions struggle to fill the gap. Laws cannot replace presence. Policies cannot replace instinct. Bureaucracy cannot replace immediate action. And when people realize that the systems they were told would replace men are slow, impersonal, and limited, anxiety increases. There is also a deep irony in how this situation unfolded. Men were criticized for assuming responsibility that was never formally assigned to them. They were told that stepping in was presumptuous. Now that they have stepped back, their absence is framed as neglect. This contradiction has not gone unnoticed by men, and it reinforces their decision to remain disengaged. For decades, many men believed that if they followed the rules, worked hard, and treated others with respect, things would work out. When that belief was challenged repeatedly by lived experience, trust eroded. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore because it is based on patterns, not promises. Men are now relying on pattern recognition rather than rhetoric. The idea that men should return to previous roles without addressing these patterns is unrealistic. Men are not unaware of the consequences of their withdrawal. They see the discomfort, they hear the complaints, they simply do not see a reason to sacrifice their well being to alleviate problems they did not create. That is not cruelty, that is self respect. This is why attempts to frame men as villains in this story fall flat. Villains act with intent. Men walking away are acting with boundaries. They are choosing not to participate in dynamics that consistently disadvantage them. That choice does not require malice, it only requires clarity. As society adjusts to this reality, there will be growing pressure to redefine expectations. Some will attempt to coerce men back into participation through policy or social pressure. Those attempts are likely to fail because compliance without consent breeds resentment, not cooperation. Others will attempt to shame men by appealing to nostalgia or moral obligation. That too will fail because men have learned that obligation without reciprocity is a trap. The only path forward that has any chance of success involves rebuilding trust at a fundamental level. That means acknowledging past excesses. It means recognizing male contributions without qualifying them. It means creating environments where good faith action is not treated as suspicious by default. And it means accepting that some men will never return, no matter what changes are made. This is another uncomfortable truth. Men who have built peaceful, independent lives are unlikely to give them up. They have adapted, they have reorganized their priorities, they have found fulfillment outside of traditional social structures. For them, walking away was not a loss, it was a liberation. This does not mean that all relationships are shallow or that all connection is undesirable. It means that connection must now justify itself. It must add value rather than extract it. That is a higher standard than before, but it is also a healthier one. Women expressing fear today are encountering a world that no longer cushions them automatically. That does not mean they are helpless. It means they are being asked to engage with reality more directly. That engagement can lead to growth, resilience, and adaptation if approached honestly. Or it can lead to frustration and resentment if framed as injustice. Men are no longer interested in being the invisible infrastructure of society. They are no longer willing to be the silent shock absorbers for systems that criticize them while relying on them. They have stepped out of that role quietly. And the echo of that absence is what many are hearing now. This is not a temporary trend. It is the result of long term incentives aligning in a new direction. Men will continue to choose peace over approval, autonomy over obligation, and solitude over chaos. And as they do, society will have to confront the consequences of relying on something it simultaneously undermined. Men walking away is not about rejecting women or society, it is about rejecting a deal that no longer made sense. It is about reclaiming agency in a world that treated male agency as suspect. And once agency is reclaimed, it is rarely surrendered again. The question now is not whether men will come back. The question is whether society is willing to change enough to make coming back rational. That answer remains uncertain. What is certain is that the silence will continue until it is addressed honestly. One of the reasons this shift feels so destabilizing is because it exposes how much of modern life depended on assumptions that were never formally acknowledged. Men were expected to absorb risk without recognition, to intervene without credit, and to shoulder responsibility without authority. These expectations were not written into law, but they were deeply embedded in social norms. When those norms were dismantled rhetorically without being replaced functionally, a vacuum was created. That vacuum is now being felt. For many years, men were told that if they objected to these changes, it was proof that they were the problem. Questioning expectations was framed as insecurity. Asking for fairness was framed as entitlement. Expressing discomfort was framed as weakness. Over time, men learned that silence was safer than honesty. And eventually, they learned that absence was safer than silence. So, what is happening now is the long delayed consequence of ignoring male disengagement as a warning sign. For years, men quietly reduced participation. They dated less, they married less, they socialized less, they volunteered less, they stopped offering help in ambiguous situations. These were not dramatic acts, they were incremental adjustments. Because they were quiet, they were dismissed. Now that the cumulative effect is visible, it feels sudden, but it is not. There is also a misconception that men walking away is driven by ideology rather than experience. In reality, it is overwhelmingly experiential. Men compare notes. They observe outcomes. They adjust behavior based on what they see, not what they are told. When the same patterns repeat across different environments, different cultures, and different social groups, conclusions form. Those conclusions do not require coordination, they emerge naturally. Many men have come to understand that modern society often treats them as disposable utilities rather than human beings. Their value is measured by what they provide, not who they are. When provision is criticized and presence is treated as suspect, disengagement becomes a form of self respect. This realization changes how men approach everything. Work becomes transactional rather than identity defining. Relationships become optional rather than central. Social approval becomes irrelevant. This is why the language of obligation no longer works. Men are no longer motivated by guilt. Guilt requires belief in shared values. Many men no longer believe those values are shared. They see double standards. They see selective accountability. They see narratives that shift depending on convenience. Under those conditions, moral appeals feel hollow. Another layer to this is how men have reevaluated risk. Risk used to be framed as noble. Taking chances for others was seen as virtuous. Today, risk is framed as recklessness unless it aligns perfectly with prevailing narratives. Men learned that even well intentioned actions could be retroactively condemned. When risk carries asymmetric consequences, rational actors avoid it. This recalibration of risk is especially visible in public interactions. Men do not intervene in disputes. They do not comment on situations that do not involve them. They do not engage in casual conversation with strangers. These behaviors are often misinterpreted as coldness or hostility. In reality, they are protective measures. Men are minimizing exposure to unpredictable outcomes. Women experiencing fear in this environment are not wrong to feel unsettled. But the source of that feeling is not male hostility, it is the absence of male participation. And absence is not aggression, it is withdrawal. Understanding that distinction matters because it determines whether solutions are even possible. Demanding that men return without addressing why they left treats symptoms while ignoring causes. It assumes that men exist to stabilize society regardless of how they are treated. That assumption no longer holds. Men are opting out of roles that offer no protection, no appreciation, and no reciprocity. What complicates this further is that many men did not consciously decide to walk away. It happened gradually, one interaction at a time, one disappointment at a time, one realization at a time. By the time the pattern was clear, they were already gone. Trying to reverse that process requires more than persuasion. It requires rebuilding trust from the ground up. Trust cannot be rebuilt through slogans. It cannot be rebuilt through demands. It cannot be rebuilt through selective empathy. It requires consistent behavior over time. It requires accountability when harm is done. And it requires acknowledging that men are not obligated to return simply because their absence causes discomfort. This is where many conversations break down. There is an expectation that men should prioritize social cohesion over personal well being, but cohesion that relies on sacrifice from one group while dismissing their concerns is not cohesion. It is exploitation. Men are no longer willing to participate in that arrangement. Another uncomfortable reality is that many men have discovered they do not miss what they left behind: the constant negotiation, the emotional labor, the uncertainty, the pressure to perform. When those things disappear, life becomes simpler. That simplicity is deeply appealing. It creates space for reflection, creativity, and personal growth. Men are rediscovering interests that were sidelined for years: learning, building, creating, exploring. They are investing in friendships that are low drama and high trust. They are prioritizing health and routine. These choices create a sense of control that many men lacked before. Once that control is established, it becomes a foundation they are reluctant to disrupt. This shift also challenges long held narratives about fulfillment. For decades, men were told that happiness required partnership, validation, and constant engagement. Many are now discovering that fulfillment can come from autonomy, competence, and peace. That discovery undermines industries and narratives built around male dissatisfaction. It is disruptive precisely because it works. Women watching this from the outside may interpret it as rejection. In some cases, it is, but more often, it is simply prioritization. Men are choosing environments where their contributions are welcomed rather than scrutinized, where their presence is valued rather than questioned, where their efforts lead to stability rather than conflict. The fear being expressed now is a signal that something fundamental has changed. But fear alone cannot reverse that change. It can only amplify it if it is expressed through blame or entitlement. Men are not motivated by fear based appeals. They are motivated by clarity and fairness. And this moment presents a choice. Society can continue to demand outcomes without addressing causes, or it can engage in honest reflection about how it arrived here. That reflection would require acknowledging mistakes. It would require letting go of narratives that treat men as interchangeable or expendable. It would require rebuilding norms that encourage cooperation rather than suspicion. Whether that happens remains to be seen. What is clear is that men walking away is not a phase. It is a response to long term conditions. And responses rooted in experience do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. Men have learned to live without external validation. They have learned to meet their own needs. They have learned to find peace in simplicity. These lessons are not easily unlearned. And as more men adopt them, the cultural landscape will continue to shift. The silence many people feel now is not empty. It is full of meaning. It is the sound of boundaries being enforced. It is the sound of participation becoming conditional. It is the sound of men choosing themselves after decades of being told they should not. Understanding that reality is the first step toward navigating what comes next. Ignoring it will only deepen the divide. The path forward, if one exists, begins with recognizing that men did not disappear. They stepped aside. And they did so for a reason that deserved to be understood, not dismissed. As this class shift continues to unfold, something else becomes increasingly obvious to those paying attention. The conversation is no longer really about safety, connection, or fairness. It is about expectation versus reality. For a long time, expectations were built on an outdated model of male participation that no longer aligns with lived experience. When reality diverges from expectation, discomfort follows. That discomfort is now being expressed as fear, confusion, and frustration. Men did not wake up one day and decide to abandon society. They adapted over time to an environment that penalized visibility and rewarded invisibility. Invisibility became a skill. Men learned how to move through public spaces without drawing attention. They learned how to avoid situations where intentions could be questioned. They learned how to say nothing, do nothing, and still maintain their own internal stability. That adaptation was not taught, it was learned through repetition. And this is why many men now say they feel more comfortable staying home than engaging with the outside world socially. Home represents control, it represents predictability, it represents a space where rules are clear and consequences are known. Outside, everything feels conditional. Words are interpreted through shifting frameworks. Actions are judged retroactively. Silence becomes safer than speech. Distance becomes safer than presence. This has also reshaped how men view responsibility. Responsibility used to be framed as something inherently noble, something to be embraced regardless of cost. Now, responsibility is evaluated through a lens of risk and reward. If taking responsibility exposes someone to disproportionate consequences, that responsibility is declined. This is not immaturity, it is rational behavior. Women expressing fear today are often responding to this recalibration without fully understanding it. They feel the absence but do not see the process that produced it. From their perspective, something essential has disappeared. From the male perspective, something burdensome has been removed. These two perceptions are colliding in real time. Another factor that cannot be ignored is how modern narratives reframed male help as conditional rather than generous. Assistance was no longer assumed to be goodwill, it was interrogated. Motivations were questioned, intentions were dissected. Over time, men internalized the message that help was no longer welcome unless explicitly requested, and even then, potentially suspect. So they stopped offering it. What replaced that informal support was an expectation that institutions would fill the gap. But institutions are slow, they are impersonal. They operate on policy rather than instinct. They do not provide reassurance, they do not offer presence. When people realize that systems cannot replicate human intervention, anxiety increases. This gap between expectation and capability is becoming more visible. The belief that structures alone could replace informal male participation underestimated how much of social stability was maintained through unspoken cooperation rather than formal authority. When that cooperation is withdrawn, systems strain. Men see the strain and recognize it as confirmation of what they already suspected. Their participation mattered even when it was unacknowledged. Their withdrawal reveals value that was taken for granted. But recognition after the fact does not automatically restore trust. Appreciation delayed too long feels strategic rather than sincere. Another dimension of this shift is how men now relate to time. When obligations decrease, time expands. Men are rediscovering what it feels like to have uninterrupted stretches of focus, to pursue interests without justification, to rest without guilt. This experience changes priorities fundamentally. Once someone experiences time as something they control rather than something constantly demanded, they become protective of it. This is why calls for men to re engage often fail. They are framed as obligations rather than opportunities. They assume that men are missing out rather than choosing intentionally. That framing does not align with lived experience. Men who have stepped away often feel they have gained more than they lost. It is also worth noting that many men are still deeply empathetic. Withdrawal does not erase empathy, it redirects it. Men reserve emotional investment for spaces where it is reciprocated and respected. They are not closed off, they are selective. That selectivity is a survival strategy, not a flaw. The idea that men owe society participation simply because society benefits from it is increasingly rejected. Obligation without consent is coercion. Men are no longer willing to accept that arrangement. They want clarity, they want boundaries, they want assurance that participation will not be punished. This brings us to a difficult but necessary point. Many of the complaints being voiced today are rooted in loss of privilege rather than loss of safety. The privilege of assuming someone else will step in, the privilege of externalizing risk, the privilege of being buffered from consequences. When those privileges disappear, the resulting discomfort is often misinterpreted as danger. This does not mean concerns should be dismissed. It means they should be understood accurately. Fear can arise from unfamiliar responsibility as much as from actual threat. Distinguishing between the two matters if solutions are to be grounded in reality rather than emotion. Men walking away has also changed the social contract in subtle ways. Expectations around dating, partnership, and family have shifted. Men are no longer willing to enter arrangements that lack clear mutual benefit. They are no longer willing to invest heavily upfront without evidence of long term reciprocity. This selectivity reduces participation rates, but increases stability among those who do participate. As a result, the landscape looks emptier but more intentional. Fewer connections but stronger ones. Less noise, more signal. That trade off appeals to many men, even if it challenges traditional narratives about fulfillment. Another reality that is difficult for some to accept is that men are no longer driven by the same incentives. Approval, admiration, and validation carry less weight than they once did. Men have learned that external validation is unstable. It can be withdrawn without warning. Internal validation is more reliable. That shift changes everything. When incentives change, behavior follows. Men are optimizing for peace rather than praise. They are choosing certainty over possibility. They are valuing consistency over excitement. These choices make sense in an environment where unpredictability carries high cost. Women observing this shift may feel that something essential has been lost, but from the male perspective, something essential has been gained. That difference in perception is at the heart of the current tension. Neither side is entirely wrong, but ignoring the male perspective guarantees continued disengagement. Rebuilding trust would require a fundamental shift in how male participation is viewed. It would require moving away from suspicion as default. It would require acknowledging past excesses without defensiveness. It would require creating environments where good faith action is protected rather than penalized. That is a long process, not a slogan. Until that process begins, men will continue to prioritize self preservation. They will continue to walk away quietly. They will continue to invest inward rather than outward. And society will continue to adjust whether it wants to or not. The absence many people feel is not a threat. It is a signal that incentives have changed, a signal that old assumptions no longer hold, a signal that participation must be earned, not demanded. Men are not waiting to be called back. They are not standing by for permission. They are building lives that do not depend on external validation. They are redefining fulfillment on their own terms. And once that redefinition takes hold, it becomes the new baseline. The question facing society now is whether it is willing to adapt to this new reality or whether it will continue to cling to expectations that no longer align with behavior. Adaptation requires humility, it requires listening, it requires acknowledging that men are autonomous individuals, not tools to be deployed. If that acknowledgement does not come, the silence will deepen, the withdrawal will continue, and the world will feel increasingly fragmented, not because men abandoned it, but because it failed to recognize what it was asking of them. Men walking away is not the collapse of society, it is the exposure of its assumptions, and exposure, while uncomfortable, is the first step towards something more honest. As this reality settles in, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The frustration being voiced is not matched by introspection. There is a strong desire for the outcome that once existed, but very little willingness to examine the behaviors and narratives that dismantled it. This is one of the core reasons the divide continues to widen. You cannot restore trust without acknowledging how it was broken. And you cannot ask people to return to a role that punished them without first changing the conditions that made that punishment possible. Men are not confused about what happened. They watched it unfold in real time. They experienced the gradual tightening of acceptable behavior, the shrinking margin for error, and the increasing consequences of misunderstanding. They saw how quickly good intentions could be reframed. They learned which situations carried hidden risk. Over time, caution replaced openness, and restraint replaced generosity. This did not require bitterness, it required awareness. Once awareness sets in, behavior changes naturally. Men began to ask themselves a simple question before engaging: what do I gain from this and what do I risk? When the answer repeatedly showed high risk and low reward, disengagement followed. This is why the current fear narrative fails to resonate with many men. Fear is not new to them. Men have been operating under fear of consequence for years, fear of accusation, fear of misinterpretation, fear of reputational damage, fear of legal and professional fallout. The difference is that men responded by reducing exposure, while many women are responding by demanding protection without acknowledging the source of the risk. Another uncomfortable truth is that men walking away has revealed how dependent certain social dynamics were on male initiative. When men stop initiating, very little happens. Conversations stall, dating slows, social momentum fades. This exposes an imbalance that was previously obscured by male effort. That imbalance is now being felt as emptiness. Rather than asking why that imbalance existed, many prefer to ask why men are no longer compensating for it. That question misses the point. Compensation is optional. It always was. It only continued because men believed it mattered and that it would be appreciated. When that belief eroded, so did the behavior. This shift also challenges long-standing assumptions about power. For years, power was framed almost exclusively as visibility and dominance. What is being demonstrated now is that withdrawal is a form of power as well. The power to say no, the power to disengage, the power to choose peace over conflict. That power is quiet, but it is effective. Men who have embraced this power are not interested in reclaiming dominance. They are interested in maintaining autonomy. They are not organizing against anyone. They are simply opting out of environments that demand too much and offer too little. This distinction matters because it changes how the situation can be addressed. Attempts to force engagement will fail. Attempts to shame disengagement will fail. Attempts to guilt men back into participation will fail. The only thing that has ever drawn people into cooperation voluntarily is mutual benefit. That principle has not changed. What has changed is men's willingness to accept vague promises instead of observable outcomes. There is also a broader cultural impact unfolding beneath the surface. As men disengage, narratives that relied on male reaction lose momentum. Provocation without response loses power. Outrage without opposition fizzles. This has a calming effect on some spaces and a destabilizing effect on others. It depends entirely on whether those spaces were built on cooperation or conflict. And men have learned that not every argument deserves engagement. Not every claim deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves defense. Silence can be protective. Silence can also be clarifying. It reveals which dynamics require constant male input to sustain themselves. This is particularly evident in online spaces, where once men might have argued, explained, or defended, many now scroll past or log off. The emotional energy once spent on debate is redirected toward personal goals. That redirection has tangible benefits. Productivity increases, stress decreases, focus sharpens. Women observing the shift may interpret it as emotional unavailability. In reality, it is emotional discipline. Men are choosing where to invest their emotional energy rather than dispersing it indiscriminately. That choice is not reversible through pressure, it is reinforced through experience. Another point that deserves attention is how this withdrawal has altered the meaning of safety. Safety is no longer defined solely by the presence of others, it is defined by predictability. Men feel safer when outcomes are clear and consistent, when rules are stable, when intentions are not assumed to be harmful by default. Many public and social spaces no longer meet that standard for men. When people say they feel unsafe, it is worth asking what kind of safety they mean. Physical safety, emotional safety, reputational safety, legal safety, these are not the same thing. Men have been navigating threats to reputational and legal safety for years. Their response was disengagement. Now others are encountering a different form of vulnerability and finding it unsettling. This convergence of experiences could create empathy if it were approached honestly. Instead, it is often framed competitively. Whose fear matters more? Whose discomfort is valid? That framing guarantees stalemate. Understanding requires recognizing that multiple forms of vulnerability can exist simultaneously. Men walking away is not about denying anyone else's experience. It is about refusing to sacrifice one's own well being indefinitely. That boundary is firm because it was learned through repetition. Repetition is the strongest teacher. There is also an economic dimension to the shift that is rarely discussed openly. Men are keeping more of their resources. They are spending less on dating, less on social signaling, less on appeasement. Those resources are being redirected towards savings, investments, and personal projects. This increases individual stability while reducing dependency. That economic independence reinforces disengagement. When you no longer rely on social approval for survival or success, you become less susceptible to pressure. Men are discovering that they can thrive without external validation. That discovery changes the balance of influence permanently. Women experiencing financial strain without shared resources are encountering a reality men have always understood. Independence comes with cost. Responsibility is heavy. There is no invisible cushion. That realization can be empowering, but it can also be sobering. How it is framed determines whether it leads to growth or resentment. The resentment path is tempting because it externalizes discomfort. It locates the problem outside oneself, but externalizing does not resolve the underlying issue. It merely delays adaptation. Men have already adapted. That is why they appear calm while others appear distressed. This difference in emotional posture is striking. Men are not celebrating the discomfort of others, they are simply not reacting to it. That lack of reaction is being interpreted as indifference, but it is actually resolution. Men have resolved their internal conflict. They are no longer torn between obligation and self preservation. They chose the latter. Once that choice is made, the world looks different. Social noise fades, expectations lose their grip, life becomes simpler. That simplicity is not empty, it is deliberate. The path forward, if one exists, requires more than asking men to return. It requires offering conditions worth returning to, conditions where participation is respected, where good faith is assumed rather than interrogated, where responsibility is matched with authority and protection. Those conditions do not exist widely at present. Until they do, men will continue to walk away quietly. They will continue to choose environments that reward consistency over chaos. They will continue to invest in themselves rather than systems that devalue them. And the silence will continue to grow. That silence is not the absence of care, it is the presence of boundaries. It is the sound of men choosing to live intentionally rather than reactively. It is the result of learning that not every call to action deserves a response. Understanding this does not require agreement, it requires honesty. The honesty to admit that outcomes are shaped by incentives. The honesty to recognize that men responded rationally to the environment they were given. And the honesty to accept that reversing this trend requires meaningful change, not rhetorical pressure. Men walking away is not a mystery, it is a mirror. It reflects the consequences of choices made over decades. Whether society chooses to look into that mirror or continue to blame the reflection will determine what happens next. As everything discussed begins to come into focus, one reality stands above all others. This situation did not arise because men suddenly changed. It arose because the environment around them did. People respond to incentives, not narratives. They adapt to conditions, not intentions. When the conditions of participation became unstable, unpredictable, and punitive, men adapted by reducing exposure. That adaptation was not emotional, it was logical. What makes this so difficult for many to accept is that logic does not negotiate with feelings. Logic does not respond to guilt. Logic does not reverse itself because discomfort has appeared on the other side of a decision. Men adapted to survive, not to send a message. The message is simply a byproduct. For decades, men were told to listen, learn, and change. They did. They listened carefully, they learned from outcomes, and they changed their behavior accordingly. Now, the same people who demanded that change are unsettled by the result. But change does not stop when it reaches a comfortable point. It continues until incentives stabilize. That stabilization has not yet occurred. Men walking away is not chaos. It is order from the male perspective. It is the removal of contradiction. It is the alignment of values with behavior. Men realized they could not be both fully responsible and perpetually suspect. They could not be both protectors and presumed threats. They could not be both providers and disposable. Faced with those contradictions, they chose coherence. Coherence brings peace. Peace brings clarity. Clarity brings resolve. This is why men who have disengaged do not appear lost or angry. They appear settled. They have resolved an internal conflict that plagued them for years. They are no longer trying to reconcile incompatible expectations. They chose themselves. That choice does not mean men lack compassion. It means compassion now has boundaries. It is no longer unconditional. It is no longer automatic. It is offered where it is welcomed and withheld where it is punished. That is not cruelty, that is discernment. Women expressing fear today are not wrong to feel disoriented. Disorientation is the natural response when assumptions collapse. The assumption that men would always step in, the assumption that someone else would absorb risk, the assumption that social stability required no maintenance. When those assumptions dissolve, the world feels sharper, more exposed, less forgiving. But exposure can also lead to growth. It can force a reassessment of expectations. It can encourage responsibility rather than reliance. It can inspire adaptation rather than resentment. Whether that happens depends entirely on how this moment is interpreted. If it is interpreted as abandonment, the response will be anger and blame. If it is interpreted as consequence, the response can be understanding and adjustment. Men cannot be coerced back into participation. They can only be invited into environments where participation makes sense. That invitation requires humility. It requires acknowledging that male contributions were real and valuable. It requires abandoning narratives that frame men as problems to be managed rather than people to be understood. It requires consistency, not performance, and it requires time. Time is the most overlooked factor in this conversation. Trust was not lost overnight. It will not be rebuilt overnight. Men learned through years of experience. They will only relearn through years of evidence. Words will not be enough. Apologies will not be enough. Only sustained change will matter. Some men will never return, regardless of what changes. They have built lives that do not depend on social validation or external approval. They have found fulfillment in autonomy. That is not a failure. It is a different outcome. Society will have to adapt to their absence rather than expect their return. Others may re engage selectively if conditions improve. But even then, participation will look different. Boundaries will be firmer. Expectations will be clearer. Reciprocity will be required. The era of silent sacrifice is over. This is not a loss for society, unless society insists on repeating the same mistakes. Cooperation is still possible. Connection is still possible, but it must be grounded in respect rather than entitlement, in mutual benefit rather than obligation, in honesty rather than narrative convenience. Men walking away is not a threat, it is feedback. Feedback that was ignored for too long, feedback that is now impossible to dismiss. Whether it is acted upon constructively remains to be seen. What is certain is that pretending nothing has changed will not work. Demanding outcomes without addressing causes will not work. Shaming men for protecting themselves will not work. The only thing that has ever worked in human relationships is alignment. Alignment of incentives, alignment of values, alignment of expectations. Men are not enemies. They are participants who chose to leave a game that no longer made sense to play. If the game changes, some may return. If it doesn't, they will continue living their lives quietly, productively, and peacefully. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Men walking away did not lead to collapse on their side, it led to stability. That stability exposes instability elsewhere. It reveals which systems relied on male sacrifice rather than mutual cooperation. Exposure is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. This moment does not require panic. It requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that actions have consequences. It requires accepting that autonomy cannot be selectively applied. If men are free to leave, then they are free to stay away. The silence many people hear now is not emptiness. It is intention. It is the sound of men choosing lives that are sustainable for them. It is the sound of boundaries being respected internally, even if they are not respected externally. As this adjustment continues, society will change. It always does. The question is whether that change will be guided by understanding or driven by resentment. Men have already chosen their path. They are not waiting, they are moving forward. And now the conversation belongs to everyone else. So I want to ask you, what did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and it is not going away. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.